Testing.
Are you the presenter tonight? No, I'm not the presenter. I'm the site administrator. All right, well, I'll give one of these. This is, I'm going to remember Veterans Breakfast Club, if you know anything about them. This magazine is all Revolutionary War stories. This is for them?
I guess when the teacher stands up in the front of the room, everybody starts to be quiet. Is that okay? Yeah, a couple minutes before I do my announcements, and then we'll get Patrick up here to get started. So continue your conversation.
And so you can already kind of see that there's some aspects to her story that suggest that her healing was not just in a physical, practical sense, but also carried with it the weight of something a little bit beyond that. And there are many writings from this time period that suggest some very similar things. And I'll describe a couple, but he goes on to describe her saying, she commenced speaking in religious strain, informing us through a lady of our party who acted as an interpreter that on serious subjects she was obliged to speak in her native tongue, the German. Her remarks breathed a strain of devotional feeling which had a solemnizing effect upon the company, and the countenance of the speaker was one of the most benign I had ever beheld. And this is a really interesting description. It's probably the most compelling description of anything in Benjamin Hollinshead's writings. He talks about a lot of things in these lofty terms, but his description of Mary is singular and very compelling. What's fascinating, though, is that his story that he wrote never saw the light of day until about 1903. So that while there's this robust history that relates to this story of him visiting the property, no one really knew about it because it was kept in his private papers. And it was only later published after it was discovered and then published in a publication known as the Pennsylvania Journal in 1903, along with the writings of one of his colleagues by the name of James Dewey. And I'll describe some of James Dewey's collection of what would basically amounted to oral history in the years immediately following her death. Next slide, please. What's fascinating about his descriptions, Benjamin Hollinshead's descriptions of her farm, is that they later formed the basis for several paintings and artistic works that were used to memorialize her after, of course, his writings were released after 1903, after basically being in his private works for just a little under a century. And you'll notice these particular depictions show Mary's log house, her milk house and spring house, and then also the bake oven as well, showing her living alone as a farmer. She's using a grain cradle. She doesn't have a grain cradle in her actual inventory at the time of her death when the contents of her farm are itemized. So it's very likely she was not using a grain cradle. And in fact, grain cradles were not widely adopted by the Pennsylvania Dutch uniformly throughout the region until after the mid-19th century. Of course, there were some people who had them, but they were few and far between. So this is a fascinating thing. And these, of course, are part of a larger selection of paintings by a celebrated artist who founded the art program at Kutztown University by the name of Henry W. Sheridan. Next slide, please. What's fascinating is that Mary's farm inventory speaks volumes about her success as a farmer. One of the most successful things, of course, is that she leaves behind like $600 in cash, which is pretty amazing for that time period. But you'll also see a wide variety of different things. It basically works the way through the house. You see things like beds and bedsteads. You'll see different items of furniture, kind of works through the space. There are spinning wheels, two different kinds of spinning wheels, one for flax and one for wool, and fiber. She doesn't have a loom. However, there was a neighboring farm that did have a loom later on. And what's interesting too is as you look through her inventory, it itemizes many different things. Everything from her growing cabbages and turnips and apples and having them in some form of a root cellar where they were stored. This may have been the lower level of the spring house. We don't necessarily know. But you'll notice as well as you go through that there's lots of information about dairy cattle. There's actually, there's two sets of cow chains, but there's only one cow and one heifer that are listed, which is what shall I say, decrease in the number of cattle that she would have had by the time that she passed away from previous years when she was known for having a larger dairy herd. And one of the things that's really fascinating too, looking at this and comparing it with other farm inventories from the area, she has no mention whatsoever of any butchering equipment, nothing related to pigs, nothing related to scalding troughs or any of the kinds of things that would have been absolutely essential on most Pennsylvania Dutch farms. And this is an interesting thing I'm going to point out because when Benjamin Hollinshead visited her in 1819, he describes that they sat down to a meal, and he describes it as being her fresh baked bread and her cheese and her cream and all this fruit. And he doesn't say anything about meat because it probably wasn't on the table. I've inferred from this that it's possible Mary was a vegetarian, or at the very least, living solitary. It's possible that she didn't want to handle the butchering by herself. But we do know that she did cooperate with other local farmers to sell her produce, especially her dairy, her cheese, and her butter, and her honey as well. And so this is a really interesting thing. There's also bee scouts that are listed on the inventory as well. Next slide, please. Now, what's fascinating is that in the years immediately following her passing, there was a colleague of Benjamin Hollinshead who visited Oley, and we don't know the precise year that he came to Oley to follow up on this story because he heard all about Mary from Benjamin Hollinshead, and he said to James Dewey, you should go to Oley and find out what people are still saying about Mountain Mary. Well, interestingly enough, he shows up and people had all kinds of things to say about her. These detailed descriptions of her garden, all these anecdotes about how she wouldn't harm animals, because in one story, she would trap marmots, is the word that they used for the groundhogs. She would trap the groundhogs in her garden, and she would find a way to trap them and carry them over the mountain and deposit them away from her property, but she wouldn't harm them because she was so concerned about their welfare, which is really fascinating. And again, kind of maybe compounds some of these ideas that you might see reflected in her inventory or in the other stories, reflecting her interest in not harming animals. He also talks in great length about her impressive dairy herd and how everyone was so impressive that she was able to do all of the farm work there and manage her farm as a solitary person. And what's exceptional about this to me is that this was a time when most farms were operating with large families, as many of you know, and farm families didn't operate in isolation either. They networked, they worked together. So when it was harvest time, your neighbors were going to help you and you were going to help them. And this was the only way that people could get it done, especially if you have variable weather. If you're making hay, you don't want to let your hay sit out longer than you need to. So you get people to help. And so it's not just your own family, it's everyone else. Somehow she managed to be this highly productive farmer on her own, which speaks volumes of her capability. It speaks volumes of her ingenuity, developing strategies to accomplish this kind of work as a solitary person. And I think a lot of folks in the past were very impressed that she did this because she was a woman. I'm not impressed with the fact that she was a woman. I'm just impressed that she did it by herself as a solitary human being on her own. So this is a pretty fascinating thing. I'm also impressed that she did this as a woman because it also says something about her character and her desire to be independent. So some lovely things coming forth from that. These two images down here at the bottom I want to explain. On the far, I guess it's your right, is an image of Mary that was produced after an image that was in the Reading Times in the 1890s. There was a correspondent by the name of Frank Brown, who later became editor of the Reading Times, and he liked to have a folklore column where he would collect these stories about local Berks County people, and a lot of stories about local healers too. But he had this image that was of Mary holding two canes and walking with her dairy perched on her head. And it's an interesting image, and this was actually kind of reproduced, true to the original, by an artist by the name of Gensler, who did a lot of the artwork for the Kutztown Folk Festival in the 1960s. And this was commissioned for the Pennsylvania Folklife magazine because the original was not very good for reproduction. And this later, of course, inspired some reenactments of Mountain Mary. This was a friend of mine by the name of Ronnie Beckinsale, who I think is 103 right now. And she portrayed Mountain Mary at the Heritage Center in Kutztown, but also at the Goshenhofen Folk Festival and a number of other locations. So many times what you're going to find is that some of these stories that come directly from James Dewey, who was the first person to talk about Mary carrying her produce down the hill to her neighbor on her head, some of those stories actually went on to influence the way that she's been interpreted, even in living history events today. Now, one thing that's really fascinating too is people talk about her extensive gardens, her medicinal gardens, and the herbs that she grew, but there was no mention of what herbs she used and how she used them. So that is left up for speculation. I do know of one place, there's one publication called Berksiana, where they talk about Mountain Mary's story, and they list all the herbs that she grew and all their uses. There's no primary source for any of that material, so I'm a bit skeptical of where they accompanied or where they discovered that particular list. But many of them would have been commonly found on local farms. But we don't know in particular what she specialized in that respect. We do know that she did not hold some form of a formal degree in medicine, obviously, but we don't know, another thing is we don't know, was she a midwife? The fact that she was consulted for care by Anne Wright in 1819 indicates there may have been some midwifery in her practice, but we don't know for sure. It stands to reason that that might be the case. But you also might have imagined her attending more baptisms too, if she was a midwife, as many midwives did. So this is a really interesting thing. One other thing I want to mention too is that James Dewey talked about Mountain Mary Road. And he didn't call it by that name, but he described the road that leads up to her farm as being of her creation. She made that road, that before that time it was a single footpath. And she decided that as she got older especially, she didn't like all the switchbacks and the steep incline. She didn't like the fact that the rain would wash it out. And so she set about with hand tools, grading a road up to her property. So if you go into Oley today and you follow Mountain Mary Road, that's the road that she graded on her own, which is fascinating to me. Again, kind of speaks volumes of her ingenuity and her capability. One other thing that's really fascinating is he talks about her income and where she got her income from. And he describes, of course, the dairy. At that point in time, selling milk was not as much of a thing because it was very difficult to keep it cold. So you sold your dairy in the form of cheese and butter, primarily butter. Butter was really where the money was. And so that's one of the places she got her income. Honey was the other, that she had multiple beehives on her property, very productive beehives. He also says that she practiced vivisection. And this is a really puzzling reference because he also talks earlier in the same passage about how she wouldn't harm animals. And if we use the word vivisection today, we typically mean live dissection. We know Mary was not performing live dissections. There not only would have been no reason to do it, but she also is, in the same article, said she would never harm an animal. So what I believe is that that word vivisection, which is written that way, may have actually been a mistranscription of venesection, which is the word specifically for bloodletting. That was kind of a clinical word, and may not have been the word that Mary would have been using. She would have probably been using Aderlassen und Schropfen, which are the two words for bloodletting and for cupping. And this would have been commonly found in every agricultural almanac, instructions for how and when to do this. Some people did it for themselves and their family members. Others went to a very specific practitioner to do this. And it was one of those things that you were paid for. So the fact that he lists this as one of the things that she's receiving monetary remuneration for suggests to me that she did practice bloodletting and cupping as a form of medicine that she was being paid for as well. Next slide, please. Now, her herbal healing is one of those things that, of course, many people today are very inspired by. I know several herbalists in the area who are inspired by the story of Mount Mary, and yet no one really knows precisely what she was doing with her herbs. Her manuscripts probably would have had a lot of information in them. If someone was ever able to track them down, that would be wonderful. So this is an interesting thing. We have an absence of information about this. But what we do know is that over time, there was this kind of accumulation of stories about her. Some folks considered her to just be a faithful bedside nurse who would visit the sick and take care of them And others would say, no, she was specializing. She was specializing in herbalism. We've got this story also of her bloodletting. Then there's also stories of her being a powwow doctor. How many of you have heard of this term before? A few of you? Okay. So this is the ritual healing traditions of the Pennsylvania Dutch, known in Pennsylvania Dutch language as brauche or braucherei. Those are the terms that are used among the Pennsylvania Dutch. It was the English Quakers who saw the Pennsylvania Dutch laying hands on people, going across a person with their hands to remove illness, and they referred to it as powwowing because they saw something that was ritualistic. They were trying to denigrate it, in fact, by pointing out that the ritualism was not to their liking. But the fact is that that term stuck to the present day, and it's no longer really used in a pejorative sense as the Quakers originally did. It was first actually recorded as a term for the Pennsylvania Dutch folk healing tradition in the 1780s in Maiden Creek Township, Berks County, in a manuscript written in English by a local German immigrant who learned English and wrote the account of his life. And he had a powwowing story in there, and he referred to the farmer who oversaw his indentureship as disapproving of powwowing. And so it was an interesting thing to see that kind of divide with the cultures of the English not being so interested in the ritual medicine, but the German-speaking folks being especially interested. And what we find too is that there were many people over many centuries who were various forms of doctors and healers who also did the ritual medicine. One particular doctor that comes to mind for me is a celebrated physician from Berks County by the name of Doc Brunner, Dr. Stanley Brunner, held multiple degrees. He was a military doctor in World War II, was a country doctor, delivered babies, lived in Crumbsville, Berks County, just a little bit north of Kutztown. He powwowed on the sides, especially to get rid of warts, because he would tell you, I can cut them off, I can burn them off, I can do all these things that they tell me to do in the medical books, but they'll probably come back. But if you come back right around the time of the full moon, I'll take your warts off with a potato and they'll never come back. And this is a fascinating story because it goes to show the way in which formal medicine has always existed alongside folk cultural beliefs and practices. They're not always at odds. I can tell you other stories where they were at odds, but they're not always at odds. And so when we think about Mary's story as an herbalist, maybe as a person who attended the sick, as some have suggested, as an itinerant nurse, members of the Daughters of the American Revolution revered her as a Revolutionary War nurse. We don't really know whether or not she ever was, but we do know that she did attend the sick. Somewhere in the midst of all of that, there's plenty of room for her also to have practiced some very culturally distinctive forms of medicine. This particular image that you see here on the right is a vignette from the top corner of a tapestry about Mountain Mary that was produced in 1938 at Kutztown University. Was at the request of Henry W. Sheridan, who was the originator of the art program there. He was teaching a continuing ed summer institute for art teachers. And many of these art teachers, they were basically one-room schoolhouse teachers who also taught art in their classrooms. But one of the teachers who kind of spearheaded the project was a fellow by the name of Paul Weand. And Paul Weand was a celebrated playwright and teacher and artist. And he coordinated this particular tapestry to be made that shows vignettes of her life based on some of the mythology that I've already discussed. Like, for instance, you'll see an image of Hill Church on the far side over here. We still have no idea whether or not she actually attended. You're going to see other things here as well, showing the cemetery on her property, her bake oven, a number of different things. Vignettes of healing, of churning butter, of prayer outside, of giving provisions to other people. You'll see her harvesting over here with a scythe and milking cows. So some really interesting vignettes in this. There's also another interesting aside here is that this image here of her healing, you'll see that there's physical contact happening. And the question is, what kind of healing is she doing in this? He's definitely implying that she was a powwower because she is using touch in the form of healing. At that point in time, and even into the present, for those who are using ritual forms of healing within the Brauche tradition, typically there's prayers or incantations that are used and the laying on of hands, or the use of hands to clear something from the body. And this is a very well documented tradition in this area that is still around to some degree. And this is meant to be a vignette showing that particular process. One other aside that I think is slightly humorous is that I've studied Paul Weand pretty extensively because he was a renowned playwright. He wrote several celebrated plays starting in the 1930s and eventually became part of the Asabe and Sabina skits that were on WSAN radio out of Allentown. And this was a classic. How many of you have ever heard of Asabe and Sabina? A couple of you have. So this was a celebrated radio show that if you ask people in this area, even 50 years ago, they would have told you, oh my gosh, the memories they had of listening to Ossabae and Sabina from the 1940s to the 1950s. This was one of the most renowned Pennsylvania Dutch language productions anywhere. And it was about a squabbling farm couple, Ossabae and Sabina, and Paul played Sabina. And the interesting thing is that, because he would raise his voice very much, and he played the part very well because Sabina was a tough Dutch lady. And she was the one who was always telling her husband how to do things. And so the interesting thing was he was channeling this kind of, what shall I say, very capable femininity, because that's his face in the very center as Mountain Mary. So there is some humor associated with this as well. Next slide, please. One of the things that we know too when we look at the history of herbalism in this area, just as I mentioned Dr. Stanley Brunner, who would do all kinds of formally trained medicine in a contemporary clinical sense, just as that was blended with ritual medicine, so too were many different aspects of herbal medicine in the past. There are 3 different examples up here that I have that would have been common practices by herbalists during the time of Mountain Mary. And I want to just describe the way in which these are used, not only in a sense in which the herb was thought to have specific properties that were meant to be healing to the body, usually through consumption or of applying it topically, but many times there were also ways in which these herbs were used in a manner that was ritualistic. They were timed. Sometimes you would harvest them in a particular direction. You might scrape the bark of the tree upwards or downwards because it might function differently with the body. It used to be that if you would collect bark from the apple tree in particular, and if you would scrape it upwards, if you would put it into a tea, it would help a person as an emetic. And if you would scrape it downwards, it would be a laxative. So these are the ways, and this was considered high medicine of the 18th century. So when we think about all of our kind of preconceived notions about medicine and herbalism, we have to remember that so many aspects of it would be outside of what we would typically think of as scientific behavior by today's standards. One of the first I have up here shows a substance called asafoetida. And you'll see that there's a crystallized version of it over here, because this is a member of the allium family that comes from a number of different places in the world, primarily originating from the Middle East. It had a very pungent smell. If you ground up the sap from it, you would get a yellow powder. And typically people would put this in a bundle around their neck, and the belief was it would keep away illness. And I know this story from my own family because my grandfather used to say that his mother made him wear asperfidity, is how he described it, to school because it would keep the illness away. But he said it stank so bad that it would keep other children away, so you wouldn't catch communicable illnesses. But this is fascinating because these 2 asafoetida bags were in the collection of Clark Hess, who lived very, very close by, who was also a friend of Landis Valley and a major collector in this area. The center shows an unlikely pairing of elderberry flowers and elderberries at the same time. The only way that anybody could have those simultaneously is if they had refrigeration, which I had when I took that picture. Those are some elderberry flowers that I harvested and some elderberries that I had frozen. These were both used in a variety of different ways. The tea itself is an anti-inflammatory. It's made out of flowers. The flowers and the berries are 2 parts of the plant that are edible, but the berries have to be cooked because otherwise you will be ingesting cyanide. And if you eat the bark or the leaves or the twigs, you will be getting cyanide poisoning if you eat enough of them. So please, by all means, anything I mentioned tonight, do your research, and I'm not responsible for any of the outcomes. But this is a really fascinating thing because the elderberry was considered by many people kind of the patron plant of midwives. And in fact, at one point in time, you would bury the placenta after a child was born underneath the elderberry. And the belief was that this would protect the child and also protect the health of the mother as well in her recuperation. This is a pretty fascinating thing. I also knew a construction worker from Berks County who worked on highway crews. He always said that he would go to his elderberry bush and take 3 leaves off the elderberry bush and he would put them in his back pocket when he was working because he said it would keep him from chafing while on the job. And it's a fascinating thing because that doesn't even have contact with his body. And yet this was an old ritual, essentially. It had to be 3 leaves, and he had to put it in the back pocket of his pants. So it's a fascinating thing, and I know people who still swear by that today. The last example I have over here is, it's my garden spade and a plantain plant and a little piece of white feather. So we know plantain's used in a lot of different ways, especially for treating bee stings. You take the leaves, you chew them up, you stick them on a bee sting, it takes the pain out of the bee sting. It's used for a variety of different things, but in the era of Christopher Sauer, who was the herbalist in Germantown during the time of the American Revolution, who made Sauer's herbal between 1762 and 1778, he recommended that you take the roots of the plantain and you put it in a bundle around your neck to remove fever. And you would remove it each of 3 days in succession. And you would put it on a stream in the direction of the rising sun. And the stream had to be flowing in the direction of the rising sun in order to get rid of the fever. So here was another example of what would have been considered a home remedy from that era that also has ritualism mixed in with it. And so it's really important when we think about folks talking about Mountain Mary, did she practice ritualized forms of medicine or not? It's very, very likely that she did, because most people who were practicing some form of medicine during that time period are doing things that we might be considering ritualistic by today's standards. Next slide, please. One thing that's really fascinating too is the references that I mentioned to James Dewey, talking about specifically her venesection or bloodletting. This would have been really common, especially in agricultural almanacs throughout the area. You would find almanacs printed here in Lancaster, printed in Philadelphia, printed in Reading, all over the place that have this image of the cosmic human on the back and all the signs of the zodiac corresponding to the parts of the body. Usually what this is meant to show, and if you follow the instructions very carefully, it tells you not to bleed the part of the body that corresponds to the sign that is currently in conjunction with the moon, because otherwise you might injure the person. So this is actually more of a preventative image rather than telling you to bleed the part of the body where the sign of the zodiac and the moon are in conjunction. So it's a complex system that's not well known today, but that same pattern of conjunction of the moon and the signs of the zodiac was used for planting, especially in this area. So many people at one point in time were very familiar with it. So this was common forms of medicine. One other quote that I think is really interesting from James Dewey is that he says that she was said to be a very intelligent and religious woman and was visited by her neighbors to have her advice on their difficulties, which was often so judicious and far-seeing that she was thought by some to have a way of acquiring knowledge unknown to many. And I think this is, again, talking again about the idea of her essentially being a wise woman in her community, someone who did more than just physical care in terms of medicine. One other story that's relevant to this is that there was another story that came out in 1903, at the same time that this account was released. The great-granddaughter of one of the wealthiest women from Reading during Mountain Mary's time, and her name was Susanna de Benneville-Kime. She was the daughter of the celebrated Universalist minister. I'm trying to remember his first name. His last name was de Benneville, and I'm trying to remember his first name, and I'm blanking on it for the moment. But the interesting thing about Susanna was she was living in Reading, and the story goes that she had a dream that Mary was dying, and that Mary was calling out to her and asking for her help. And she got on a horse with her grandson in the middle of a snowstorm and went all the way up to Oley, which was, I think, roughly about 15 miles. And what's interesting is they get there and Mary is sick in bed. The fire hasn't been lit for about a week, and it's the middle of the winter, and she's dying. And so they attend to her until she dies, and it's about the following week is when she dies. She dies on November 16th. 1819, and they buried her on November 18th. So it's a fascinating thing to hear that there's this story of this kind of otherworldly experience of having Mary visit her in her dreams. And we might think about that as supernatural, but Susanna de Benneville-Kime specifically said that it was among one of her highest honors to have attended Mary at the time of her death. And this was like a moving religious experience for her. So you make your own decisions about how you view some of the more supernatural aspects of her story. But for what we might consider to be supernatural today, other people in the past might have seen it as part of their folk beliefs associated with their religious practices. Next slide, please. Of course, I talked a little bit about powwowing as being kind of this process of using ritual, specifically the laying on of hands, incantations, for the healing and protection of humans and animals. But Mary was not the first person to have been considered a saint who practiced this. In fact, there are many different people over the years who kind of had this epithet of being a saint relating to healing, especially women. And one of those was the woman right over here on the right, Sophia Leininger Baylor, and she was considered to be the saint of the coal regions because she was attributed to a number of miraculous happenings in the coal regions during times of big emergency. Several different collapses in coal mines resulted in the injury and sometimes entrapment of coal miners at the bottom of these mine shafts. And I heard some of these stories through firsthand accounts, talking to people who were close to the community at that point in time. I knew the daughter of her pastor. And the story that I heard was that she initially went to go visit her pastor when her pastor was new to the community. And her daughter was there too. And remember very distinctly, she said, "So you're going to hear a lot of stories about me and about all the things that I do. And when I call a blessing on someone else, I want you to know that it's a religious practice." She said, "But if you ever need anything, if anybody's ever in trouble, don't hesitate to call upon me." Now, my understanding was that people would call the pastor when these mine collapses happened. And Sophia Baylor was in Tremont. And her pastor would get these calls because oftentimes pastors were also first responders as chaplains at that point in time. Well, he would say, "I'll be right over, but you might want to reach out to Ms. Baylor." And so this was an interesting opportunity where you see a religious figure who's also essentially, in one way, shape, or form, encouraging people to engage with these traditions. At the very least, he respected her role in the community. One of the stories that was especially attributed to her was a story where there were three men who were trapped at the bottom of a mine shaft, and one of them was bleeding to death. And they were able to communicate with people on the surface by shouting up to them, but nobody could get down to them, and they were covered with debris. And they called Sophia Baylor, and she said, "Can you please give me the first, middle, and last name of this person?" which was required for the powwowing ritual. And then she repeated verses from the Bible, chapter 16:6 from the book of Ezekiel, which goes, "When I passed by thee and saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, when thou wast in thy blood, live. Yea, when thou wast in thy blood, live." And each time that she said the word blood, she would insert the person's full name, their first, middle, and last name, and make the sign of the cross. The irony was she was doing it over the phone, because at that point in time, she did most of her healing over the telephone. And she was still thought to be absolutely effective. And of course, the person who was bleeding to death never bled to death. So this was a miraculous occurrence attributed to Sophia Baylor from the coal regions, yet another female saint associated with healing among the Pennsylvania Dutch. Next, please. Now, one thing that's really fascinating to me is if you look at some of the prayers associated with the ritual healing of the Pennsylvania Dutch, there's one prayer in particular that invokes Mary. And I've heard a number of different aspects of these traditions, both in terms of healing and then also to some degree in terms of kind of these prognostication rituals or ways of being able to tell what the weather is going to be relating to Mary. And of course, these weren't relating to Mountain Mary originally. These were relating to the Virgin Mary. And these were part of deeply held folk cultural beliefs associated with folk religion in this area. And one of these is a prayer that was used to purge parasites. And it describes Mary going over the land, holding 3 worms in her hand, that the first was white, the second was black, the third was red. And you're supposed to rap on the person's back and say, "With that, I strike the worms dead." And this is an interesting prayer that I had learned over the years working with local people in the community, documenting experiences associated with powwowing, and people didn't know who Mary was. They assumed it was Mountain Mary. The same thing happened during an oral history that I conducted with a woman in Charlottesville who told me about this great weather prognostication ritual that basically in May at the time of the visitation of the Virgin in the old liturgical calendar, if it's raining, it means it will be dry at the time of the Assumption of the Virgin in July. And so you can predict the weather during that time period. And it would go something like this: "Van die Maria über die Bade geht für ihre Schwester Besuche, wann es trocken ist, wird es nass, wenn sie kommt wieder zurück." And so this particular proverb literally says, when Mary goes over the mountain to visit her sister, if it's dry when she leaves, it will be raining when she comes back. And this is an old saying that a lot of people in this area, especially native speakers of Pennsylvania Dutch, remember from their childhood. I asked the lady who told me this, and I said, "Well, tell me, who's Mary?" And I'd already heard of this, but I was curious about who she would attribute it to. And she said, "Well, gosh, I don't know. Do you think it's Mountain Mary?" Because in her mind, she wasn't even thinking of the Virgin Mary. Because at that point in time, especially among Pennsylvania Dutch people, they were not so much interested in the Virgin Mary because it was seen as too Roman Catholic. So it would never have entered her mind to think that previous generations of people would have revered the Virgin Mary. So it's an interesting way in which these types of legends get layered over top of Mountain Mary's story. Next slide, please. I want to show one other thing. Accompanying this, just yesterday evening, there was an exhibition opening at Penn State main campus called Paper in Paradise. And it was a study of the paper arts in the past and in the present. And I was one of the featured artists in it. And this was a piece of Sharon Schnitter that I produced at Mountain Mary that was inspired by that three worms prayer. You can kind of see over her hand, there's the three worms. And it's an interesting aspect of her story, the way in which these get layered over other stories regarding the Virgin Mary and aspects of her sainthood. Next, please. And of course, this all leads to the idea that when we think about a saint, we're really thinking about the way in which saints are the embodiment of the divine on a human scale, something we can relate to, whether or not you are part of a faith tradition that includes the veneration of saints like the Roman Catholics do, or the saints in the terms of Protestants who think of all people as saints. Depending on how you look at this, we still think about this as being the opportunity to witness something about the nature of the divine in human beings. And Mary definitely represented this. And there were many different stories from Mary's time period associated with women, especially, who were considered saints. One of those that was printed at Ephrata, a common, very popular chapbook, tells the story of Genevieve, who is a woman who goes into the wilderness after she is condemned to death. It's a long story, but there is a suspicion that she's been unfaithful to her husband, which she wasn't. So the husband, who is a count, has her cast out into the wilderness, and she's pregnant. And his idea was that she was to go out into the wilderness to die. She doesn't die. She gives birth to her baby. There's a deer that suckles the baby. And so they both live and they're surviving. And then eventually the count finds out that he was wrong. And he also finds out that his wife is still alive. And the story is supposed to be one of piety. She comes back and is welcomed back, and she forgives her husband. And I'm kind of indignant about the whole thing because I'm not sure how forgiving I would be if I were in her position. I'm just going to say it. But nevertheless, this was meant to be a story about piety. So this again was about ways in which people could witness miraculous aspects of the divine at the human scale. And Mountain Mary was definitely one of those as well. Next slide, please. The first real mention we know of Mountain Mary being called a saint is in the work of Daniel Bertollet, who was a celebrated preacher and hymnist in the evangelical tradition. And he was also at one point in time a state senator. And he writes in his day book on the 18th of November in 1819, it literally says, "Today, Mary on the mountain was buried. Help, Lord, for thy saints have been reduced." And then it goes on to say that her body looked so lovely and so beautiful that is without doubt that she is in eternal rest. And the interesting thing about this is that even though the part that's in quotes is taken directly from Scripture, help Lord, for thy saints have been reduced, it is indication of the way in which people, even during that period of time, were considering her one of the saints. And this is something that kind of took on even more volume in the generations that followed. Next slide, please. Mary was buried in a family plot that already contained the grave of her mother and her sister. Her will provided provisions for the construction of a wall around the cemetery. And this is a really interesting space. It's on private land today. If you were to go up Mount Mary Road, you might not be able to find it. If you do find it, talk to the people who live there, because there is a field right in front with two bulls that live in that field, and you have to cross through their meadow to get to it. And there's also an electric fence. So my suggestion is be a good neighbor if you're interested in Mount Mary, and talk to the owners before going back to the cemetery and pay your respects. But the interesting thing is I know the stonemason who reset the wall, because the wall eventually crumbled. Even as the early 20th century, it had fallen apart. There are photographs of it. Multiple people rebuilt it over the years. The stonemason who rebuilt this found a dog skeleton in the west wall, which is an old tradition where you take the family pet, you put the family pet in the wall because the belief was it would protect you. So it would serve as kind of like a spiritual guardian. Again, another interesting tradition kind of wrapped in and through the stories of Mountain Mary. We don't know who the fourth grave is. Some people have suggested it was her sister from New York, but I have a hard time imagining that they brought her sister from New York down to Berks County. Not impossible, but unlikely. So that is one of the things that we still have yet to find out. Next slide, please. Daniel Bertollet also wrote a lofty 4-stanza poem about her life that was listed as her Grabschrift, so literally as her epitaph text. And what's interesting about it is we don't know if this was read at her funeral. It appears that it may have been. And it is this kind of lofty poem that I have a kind of quick translation over here. The German is much more poetic and much more interesting. It has a beautiful, ring to it. But basically, it describes a couple things. It talks about her living in solitude for 3 decades, and then it especially identifies this idea of her being this person who somehow was emblematic of bliss and grace and all of these different types of virtues. And so she was seen as kind of the personification of all these positive aspects of what we could witness in one another. So such an interesting piece. And this has been translated in English many times with rhyme and meter and other things, but none of the English translations really capture the original meaning. So I did a new translation that you could check out over there if you would like to see it. But it's a really fascinating piece. And again, referencing the way that people considered her, even after her death, as being a form of, as being part of spiritual inspiration. Next slide, please. After her death, there were these pilgrimages that started, and we don't precisely know when, but we know they were especially popular in the early 20th century, that folks would gather together. They would gather at Hill Church, and then they would go from Hill Church to her grave. They would walk. It's not that far. And over the time that people would do these pilgrimages, folks would bring out works of art to share with other people. They would talk about Mountain Mary and describe new discoveries they made about her history. They would read poems. Many different poems were written about her. This is an example. You'll see 2 of the vignettes you might have recognized from before, her milking the cow and her harvesting her grain. This was painted by Henry W. Sheridan, and it's a pretty massive altarpiece. It's a triptych, so it opens up. The outer edge shows vignettes of her property. On the inside, primarily shows acts of farming and acts of piety, and then a kind of classic image of her as an older woman in classic 19th century Pennsylvania Dutch garb. And it's a pretty fascinating piece from a number of perspectives, but he actually physically carried this to the grave, and it was a big honking piece. So I can imagine it would be pretty exhausting to carry it. But this is just one of many pieces that were inspired by Mountain Mary's story, and it was used in the acts of the pilgrimage as well. Next slide, please. And here's an image of Henry W. Sheridan in his studio with the piece that eventually ended up in a private collection in Montgomery County. Next slide, please. I led a pilgrimage to Mountain Mary's grave, and I've taken many people there over the years because I do know the property owners. Again, I encourage anybody who tries to do this, don't do it on your own. Try to talk to the property owners.
Well, there's an electric fence.
There is an electric fence. You can get under it, but be careful, and then you've got 2 bulls to concern yourself with. So you better be able to run. But I led a pilgrimage to Mountain Mary's grave in 2009. It was one of a couple times that I did this. This was the largest group that I worked with. And the interesting thing was that at that point in time, the people who were attending it, some of them were local members of churches and local community members, but a fair number of these folks were younger generations of people who were exploring alternative spiritual modalities. So these are people who were maybe not Christians, or maybe Christians in a very different way. And what was fascinating about it was that many people, the older generations who grew up with Mountain Mary's story, and the new generations who were rediscovering Mountain Mary's story, were all finding aspects of her story that resonated with them. And to me, this was a really positive thing, because I hear often enough from people that Pennsylvania Dutch culture is somehow becoming less relevant, or maybe becoming a thing of the past. And I have to tell you that it is alive and well, and there's a lot of interest. And this is just one of those areas that shows aspects of that. Mountain Mary is actually one of the figures that we get the most questions about at the Heritage Center at Kutztown. So this is part of a perennial interest. And I think it's related to people's sense of place. If you're living in Berks County, anywhere near Oley, people consider this their local saint, their local figure that they want to know about. It's part of their regional experience. But they also recognize the way in which she's part of a broader story associated with the culture. Next slide, please. And I want to wrap up by just saying that her story, just as I mentioned before, with the artists who contributed to the exhibition at Kutztown, her story's still being written. There's lots of research yet to do. I'm hoping to find more things maybe in the Quaker archive, because I have a suspicion that since so many Quakers were close with her, that she may have been a Quaker and might find some additional pieces. My hope is that there's more works of art being produced, more poems. I know of folks who are currently singing original songs about Mountain Mary's story. And my hope is that this will continue to be something that inspires folks to look at their roots as either Pennsylvania Dutch people or as people living in this region in southeastern Pennsylvania, where we can learn more about the origins and development of this region through the story of Mountain Mary, how people wrestled with a wide variety of different kinds of challenges and conflicts, living through war, illness, adversity, and rising to the level of being a folk hero by means of just being kind and helping people. What a wonderful story that we have through Mountain Mary. So thank you all for coming out. I want to open up for questions if there are any. And if I could have next slide, please, just for a moment. I want to let you know that if you're interested in learning anything more about Mountain Mary, we do have an online exhibition of all of those pieces that I described on the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center's website, and you'll be able to check these out. And there's a bunch of history about her on there as well. So if you're interested, check it out. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Right here in the back, yeah.
What was the purpose of inventorying her?
It was a legal requirement to inventory Mountain Mary's, the contents of her farm and her possessions. This was usually a requirement following a will, because if you have a will and the will says that certain objects are to be given, someone has to actually verify that those objects are there. And then also, if they say a share of my, the sale of my goods must go to this person or to this person, they have to be able to liquidate those assets, and legal proceeding requires the inventory of all of those assets and then a very careful tabulation of what is received for all of those assets at sale. And so many of these are public documents. Like if you can actually find Mountain Mary's will and her inventory on public records through the Berks County Recorder of Deeds and also the will office there. So these are all public records that are actually available. So it's part of a legal proceeding. And this is also why we know that she was definitely single, because her legal designation was that she was a single woman. And at that point in time, if you were a widow, you had to say so. And she didn't. So that's a really important thing. Here, yes.
Has anybody examined her DNA to see if they can find other relatives in that area?
I don't know how we would obtain it. I'd be curious.
Dig her up.
I would suggest not, but so there are some folks who are, I believe, descended through her sister's family, and I'm trying to remember the last name of the heirs who actually came. They actually, so it was her sister's daughter's children. Her sister had married, and I believe the last name was Butz. So there's a number of different lines from that family, but there were folks who are related to her and see her as part of their family tree, but no direct descent. So we don't know. But good question. Right over here, yes?
Where is the Hill Church that you're talking
The Hill Church, so this is really fascinating. Hill Church is a Boyertown address, but it's technically very close to the village of Pikeville in Berks County. In the past, it was part of District Township, now it's Pike Township. And in the past, they also referred to Hill Church as Die Welschkankreich in Pennsylvania Dutch, which means the corn church. Because allegedly at one point in time, there was some form of a porch on the building, and it was known that some people dried their corn under it. And it got a reputation that it was this country bumpkin church. In the original church ledgers, they referred to it as the church in the Oley Hills, the Urligen Berge, which is also interesting because it kind of sounds like the oily hills in German as well, because Urberg was the Mount of Olives. So there's also like kind of a double entendre there.
There's a Hill Church that is near Mount Gretna.
Okay, that is up in Anvil.
Lutheran.
Oh, are you thinking of the one that's in the Lutheran? In Andersonville. So that's,
No,
what's that? Mastersville.
Mastersonville.
Okay, I'm familiar with that church. I've been there and I've documented it's a stone church. It's a stone church, right? It's brick? Okay. Well, I know of one that's stone that's right on the edge of Dauphin County.
No, this is very close to Lebanon County.
Okay.
Actually, it's sort of,
Lebanon, Lancaster, if it's Mastersonville,
yeah,
would be right over.
Township.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I know of another one. There's another Hill Church that's in Dauphin County, and then there's another one that's in Anvil, north of Anvil,
Well, this
and that's
is-
where
I'm
my
not
family
sure what
originally comes
county
from.
it is in. Could be in Lebanon.
Okay.
It's in Randall.
Absolutely. Another question back here. Yep.
We're all from the Oley Valley, and
Great.
we've got some culture.
Okay, great.
What is the artist's name?
The one in the middle, his name is Sean Warner. He's from Lancaster. Oh, he's a fabulous painter. He does all kinds of these allegorical altarpieces. This one has Mountain Mary in a veil. She's got antlers depicting her connection with the wilderness, and milk coming from her palm, talking about the way that she fed other people. It's very allegorical, esoteric in many respects, and a beautiful piece. But yes, done by Sean Warner from Lancaster County. And a question from the congregant from Hill Church. Yes.
Another Oley, she's the
Yeah, yeah.
church.
Oh, okay.
Is the Braucherei that you were talking about the same thing as Hexerei, or is that different?
Two different things. So
Okay.
in Pennsylvania Dutch, you have the word Braucherei, which literally it's a collective term that means that word, the suffix rye usually involves some form of a plural. And the word Brauche means to treat with medicine in Pennsylvania Dutch. It also means to need, or it can mean to make use of, but really it has to do with this idea of having a sense of skill and employing it through the treating of medicine. And Braucherei is then the collection of those traditions. Hexerei, on the other hand, is the word that's used to describe ritual forms of witchcraft that are used primarily for harming other people. And these are not diametrically opposed. Like a lot of folks like to look at it as like a white magic, black magic. I think that's overly simplistic. I think of them being as fundamentally different things. Braucherei is really a much more larger, broader set of traditions. It's integrative. It incorporates a wide range of different types of customs and beliefs and practices, not only the specialized forms of healing, but the kinds of observations you would be doing on special saints' days, the scattering of ashes around your barn on Ash Wednesday to keep the parasites out of your barn, that kind of thing. That's also part of Brauche tradition. These were done by everyday people, not just by healers who were specialized. Hexerei, on the other hand, is a marginal practice that would have been typically done by an individual who was often kind of separate from society. They may have done some healing, but most of what they were known for was something that would have been more along the lines of predatory ritual behavior, the punishing of other people by casting of a spell or a hex or something like that. And of course, the word has been used in a lot of different meanings. Today, when people talk about hex, they might be even looking at it in a positive sense. But that is a very contemporary look at the tradition, as opposed to the way it was envisioned in the past, which was very much through the lens of it being a predatory form of ritual behavior. And I'm not going to say that there was never any crossover between Braucherei and Hexerei, because clearly there are aspects of healing that were done by some people who practiced Hexerei. But if a person is healing and then also cursing, they were not necessarily going to have the same kind of status that Mountain Mary had as a person who was revered for their healing. Although there is a story that claims that Mountain Mary had this owl that was visiting her farm. And I usually don't even tell this story because it's kind of after the fact, apocryphal. But there was this owl that would visit her farm and would take her milk in whatever way an owl could take milk. I don't know. But she was getting so tired of this pesky owl that apparently in this moment she grabbed the owl and she burned its feet on the hearth, even though other accounts say she never harmed animals. And the story was then that the local neighbor lady woke up in the morning with burnt feet, and that it was indicating that she was the witch who was coming to take the milk. But this is very much part of some of the witchcraft stories that you hear among the Pennsylvania Dutch, but I don't believe that it probably had anything to do with Mount Mary. So, but it was a story that was sometimes told. One other question here, and then back over here. Yes.
The development kind lady you were talking about, is she related to, is a Devenville house in the Oley Valley?
Yes, yes.
Is that the same?
Yes,
family?
it's his daughter. So it was Georg de Benneville was the name I couldn't think of earlier. He had actually lived in the same household with Queen Anne at one point in time. He was nobility. He was also a celebrated philosopher and Universalist minister. Came to the Oley Valley, was really like a celebrity in his era. His daughter married. I'm trying to remember the name of the kind that she married, but she was one of the wealthiest people in Reading at that point in time.
My best friend growing up lived in Devenville.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I know exactly where it is because there's a historical marker right there.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. I saw one other question back here. Yeah.
Do you when researching Mount Mary, do you come up along a lot of stories about some other Mary because it's a common name?
Yeah, and I actually found other Mary Youngs. Like I said, in the Hill Church records, there are There are other Mary Youngs, but they're not the same Mary. But yeah, there's lots of different Marys. And it's always challenging when you're looking at records from a given period of time and you're trying to find out about a person because names are often repeated. And Anna Maria was a very common name. And so this is pretty standard to come across. And it requires us to be especially attentive to locations, estimated ages, recorded ages, neighbors when it comes to property records and things like that. We have to be really careful about context in order to ensure that we're getting the right person. But yes, absolutely. And I saw another question over here. Yeah.
Any idea where Mary and her family came from, what part of Germany, or based on her dialect or how she wrote her German, any guesses? Or?
Well, her writing would have been standard German for the day, so she was not doing any dialect in her writing. We have several different folks who put different stories first, or forward, I should say. One was Wollenweber that I mentioned, who wrote the novella about her being a Revolutionary War widow who escaped the world. That story claims that she was from Zweibrücken, which is also in the Pfalz, which is, not too far from where Wollenweber was from. So he favored the idea that she would have been essentially from the same area that he was from. And that was a deliberate choice on his part, because in absence of actually having that information, he filled it in. Today we have the benefit of the, James Dewey's stories and Benjamin Hollinshead's stories. They didn't have those back then. And so people were interested in her story in the late 19th century, and basically all they had to go on was oral tradition. The primary sources that I'm using are things that were only discovered within the past 100 years. So really important there. Other folks have said she came from the vicinity of Frankfurt am Main. Basically, all of these locations are approximations, assuming that she would have been from the Palatinate.
Okay.
But we don't know for sure. I know my ancestry comes from all over the place. I have ancestry from Switzerland, from Alsace, which would have been part of Germany at that point in time. And so we have no idea. She could have been from any number of places. And there are folks who are part of the Pennsylvania Dutch diaspora who literally came from all corners of what we know of as German-speaking regions today. So really, we can say the Pfalz would have been the primary concentration, but that was really the gathering place where people left from to go up the Rhine River to leave Europe, and to leave typically through Rotterdam or Amsterdam. So really important aspect of her history. I saw another question over here. Yep.
You mentioned that there is no documentation of any specific herbs that she may have used. But
Yes.
are there any garden designs or references to plants that she generally grew on her farm?
Nothing that we really know of. I know that James Dewey describes the size and how impressive her garden is. He doesn't talk about specific herbal varieties, but there were several folks who gathered information. Frank Brown that I mentioned, who wrote for the Reading Eagle, or I'm sorry, the Reading Times in circa 1890. He claimed that there were varieties of apples that had been growing on Mountain Mary's property that folks locally traded and swapped cuttings from, and that there were several different varieties of apples that were named. One in particular was called Good Mary's apple, because it was one of Mountain Mary's apples. But even at that time, nobody was writing down what types of botanical cures she was using. So it really does remain a mystery. And we can make lots of inferences based on what was traditional during that time, but really no way of knowing. I thought I saw another question right over here.
Has anyone ever attempted to go to Albany? You said that her journals and things went to Albany, New York, and look in any type of like archives to see if they could find her?
Yes, and it hasn't turned anything up. So no good. So there's one figure, a controversial figure, who was the state folklorist in the 1940s by the name of Henry W. Shoemaker. And Shoemaker claimed he knew exactly where the journals were, but he wouldn't tell anybody. And he was also known as a fabricator, because many of the stories that he put forward about local legends were not true, even though he worked for the state of Pennsylvania, was the first official state folklorist. I don't know if there was ever a folklorist after him. I don't think so. I think it was just a way.
We don't do that anymore.
Well, I think he was a retired diplomat from, was it Hungary or something like that? So really interesting fellow, but he claimed he knew where they were. And there's even a newspaper article of him showing a completely different book, talking about how he knows where Mountain Mary's journals are. If they had materialized, someone would know about them, I'm sure, but we don't know at this point. But yes, no. Nothing's been turned up. Anybody over here? Yeah.
To follow up on her question, is there any idea of the motivations her family had to come to America? Like, we know why the Schwenkfellers came, that's very documented.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there any primary source about that?
Well, we don't know. There's a lot of different writers who've said different things. There's a couple writers who claim that she fled religious persecution. How they do that, we don't know, and they didn't say a source. There's one particular bit of writing that was done, I want to say it was in the 1920s, in a publication for the Proceedings of the Berks County Historical Society. And it says a lot of things about what people say about Mount Mary. And that was one. Oh, she must have fled for religious reasons. And that's a very commonly repeated story that many folks assume that, especially because there were certain groups of Pennsylvania Dutch people who were descendants of Anabaptists, especially your Amish, your Mennonites, your brethren, other pietists, radical pietists. These would have been people who would have been put to death if they had stayed in Switzerland, for instance, or in other parts. But there were also Catholics who came to Pennsylvania, and depending on where they were not so welcome. And then, of course, there were Lutheran and Reformed folks who came here, who largely came here because of economic opportunity. So what we really find is a mixture of motivations. Without knowing more about the precise context, it's going to be really challenging to say what was her motivation, what was her family's motivation. What we do know is that when we look at the broader spectrum of the Pennsylvania Dutch experience, there were roughly 81,000 German-speaking immigrants who came through the port of Philadelphia prior to the time of the American Revolution. And around 4% of those, just under 4% of those, were considered members of the Anabaptist and Pietist communities that would have been considered radicals and would have been persecuted in Europe for their religion. The rest would have been centrist Pietists and basically mainstream Protestants during that time period. So roughly 95% would have been Lutheran and Reformed. Some people incorporate the Moravians into that. Some people try to put the Moravians into the sectarians, but it depends on who you talk to. And little less than 1% were Roman Catholic. So I would say the bulk of the Pennsylvania Dutch experience was not so much motivated by religion, but was motivated by economic opportunity. Although they established churches here and were very, very, what shall I say? They were excited by the idea that you could come to a place and there was no state mandated religion, that they could choose their own trajectory, and often did. So, but yeah, I don't know, and there's not really much. I do find there's a lot of people who like to kind of co-opt her and say, oh no, she must have been a Mennonite. Oh no, she must have been a Lutheran. And folks really like this idea that they could kind of take Mount Mary into their story. And I think it speaks to the fact that folks really want to relate to her. They want to relate to her legend. And they want to be able to say that somehow or other the story of their ancestors crossed paths with Mount Mary because of how significant she was. All right, without further ado, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you, and I want to make one last announcement. I brought a couple publications along, including the exhibition catalog from the Mount Mary exhibition. If anybody's interested, I have them here tonight on behalf of the Heritage Center at Kutztown. If you're interested in picking one up, I'd be happy to sign it. And all proceeds will go to supporting cultural programming at Kutztown University. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much. Our next lecture is on June 28th. Last Friday of June, Scott Mingus doing the Underground Railroad and Lancaster County. Thank you very much for coming. Feel free to take a picture too. And thank you again. Thank you. There were a few folks that they were interested. We know of a painter that's well documented in the Berks County area by the name of Bill. I worked with his family to produce their biography of Bill, and he was a very great painter, and he claimed that they had absolutely no relation whatsoever to Hexeroi or any of these other stories, that they were purely artistic. And his story was that he first was a third-generation painter, and would have been following the traditions. Father and grandfather, he never heard the term Hexer until the 1940s, because it didn't originate from within the culture, it came from outside the culture. There was one particular travel writer from New England named Wallace Lilly,
who essentially launched the term, invented the term in the 1920s as an explanation of why people would read their minds.
Why do you think that?
Because they typically were decorating their buildings the same way. I do know of a couple of Mennonites who, even in recent years, decorated the park, but they only did it for the tradition. They moved up their cultural values in very different ways. Besides their barn, absolutely, thank you.
I don't think I've worked it.
Yeah, fantastic. I think I might have one, and if I don't, maybe somebody else has. Fantastic. You know, I spoke to Sherry Lee, who is, yep, and no, actually, the time I saw her interview with her, because she was volunteering. And we got the story of the
Yes, so there's some place, I've never related to him. Then I looked it up, my great sister Mary is his mother. So he's my cousin.
Wow.
Oh, you're not gonna be around anymore, you're not dead.
That is a bad.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And I'm also glad you came up and sat down. Otherwise it would have been in the doorway.
Thank you.
Well, it's just like church, everybody sits in the back. All right, nice to meet you.
Oh, wow, wow, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I unfortunately only accept cash or a check, and I don't have any change with me. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and is this your pen? Okay, I'm going to double check to make sure. I'm going to have to find a spot to sign. That's school.
oh, it's the house on the farm. It's the farmhouse on the farm. Oh, that's yeah, this is cultural.
Yeah, there's a couple different pieces in there. The one that's this one right here. That was there. That was a lot of put together. So,
That's what it is.
yeah, it's been
That's really how they treat the house. But then this is actually like the wall. And there was a building
on the side, kind of along the side, or
described the
or maybe down here.
This is the schoolhouse. Up on the line. Where we lived outside of Goodstead. That was closer there. She had the schoolhouse.
Well, I definitely, it's a story that really captured my interest because there's just so much more work we need to do. There's so much uncharted territory, and I think for a long time people thought the story was a case closed. I find that there's a lot more.
I don't know.
So, I run the Center for the smaller ones, it's a Dutch class, and then, in, the spring, we'll be teaching the introduction to the for the students. So, $10 a change.
My father would tell you when it was gonna rain. And he
Oh,
was
that's fantastic.
by looking at the leaves on the tree. And he was always very good.
Yeah, I did too. Yep. I spent quite some time. This man is not showing up.
See.
Okay, we'll see. Sometimes this, oh, yep, it is showing up. Okay.
So that makes it, are you saying that, see, like, these were thinking, because I know they took that to Oley out in, he had this tours.
He was,
I think he did his resource for it.
yes.
And the other thing I was thinking, you know, for, because the other comes to the neighbors.
My mother
There's
is
no study. Many areas of connection that you could take from just looking at the world.
about a year and a half. And,
maybe, because of people that are so much in the means of complaints, so they're coming down through here with get the cost of and then get the youth through the American, and then they go out west. And I thought it just started out to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There would be, maybe a gem or two.
That's definitely worth checking. I appreciate it. Thank you. And what's your last name again? Sorry. Okay.
My dad would say, just call me strict, because the rest doesn't matter.
Yes.
Okay, remembers it, so that's.
That's true.
I'll send him an email. I haven't talked to him in a
We
little
wouldn't
bit,
be
but.
here.
I worked here, for a number of years. Thank you. Absolutely. Wish you well. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Very
How are you?
good. Oh, very good program.
Thank you. Glad you enjoyed it.
It was excellent. This is the second lecture I've heard of Mountain Mary.
Oh.
And you were definitely.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it was good. I tried to do my very best to make it interesting and relatable. So.
Yes. I'm looking to go to Kutztown in the fall.
This pen is not showing up on the.
Oh,
Does anybody have one? Here. I had that problem with another one too.
here.
Use my pen.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Very interested in local history.
Okay, well, if you come to Kutztown, you will definitely have to check out the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center.
I'm planning on it.
And you
I'm definitely going to be a research librarian.
Oh, cool, fantastic. Well, we do a lot of, what shall I call them, experiential learning opportunities for library science students, anthropology students, folks who minor in Pennsylvania studies, and because our site has a library archives, it's like especially right now very popular with library science students. So, yeah, if you're stop by, let us know if there's ways that we can help you. Eventually, a lot of students have to do internships, and that's one of the ways that we try to connect with library science students. So, absolutely.
I'm so thrilled. She's my
I
granddaughter.
actually got a copy in town in Harrisburg before we
My family was in town.
Oh, okay.
All our ancestors were here from the early 1700s, so I've been trying to pass that into my grandchildren.
Yeah, excellent.
We actually visited the grave sites of the first individuals who came over from Germany.
That were Ethnics.
Okay.
They fought in the Revolutionary War.
Okay,
In the
excellent.
Battle of Trenton.
Wonderful.
They fought. According to my mother.
Excellent. Excellent. Wow, I wasn't aware of that. Fantastic. Thank you.
We were. My grandmother was there. No. So I'll let her do it.
You guys should have contact.
And whatever.
You're related. You're family. You're family. You're family.
Oh!
Sorry.
I really, I do my best to put together something that's gonna be interesting, and it's always a little bit different, because every once in a while I forget something, we're all, you know.
And no, I was planning to do this last time, but just.
Me too, what, all the things she could have told me. I do teach certification in Pennsylvania Dutch, in the fall at Kutztown University, and then I also do class on, the introduction to Pennsylvania German studies. So,
And his family.
She's from upstate New York.
never heard of them. That's where Mount Mary's, sister's family went, up to Oley. There you go. Absolutely. Thanks for saying so. I appreciate it.
No.
Absolutely.
I was at the climate
I am. I was there too.
I know you were, because it's like, oh, I didn't realize this was the same person.
Yes.
I was there for a long time and just really enjoyed everything to say.
Oh, great. Thank you. No problem. Thank you for saying so. Thanks for coming by. What were you doing at Connie? Were you volunteering or were you just attending?
Julie doesn't say.
Oh, okay.
My first husband was. And then my mother was an attorney and I wanted to see
Oh, that's great. I didn't get around to see any of it. Honestly, I was kind of captive in the back room.
Yeah, that was more captive in the back room. That was the nicest part because, I had said, who said it was gonna be there? Oh, I want to volunteer. And, gave me a contact, just got on, and hear back from them. And so we could work with women, I could go around and I could talk to people and spend time listening to people speak about backwards. All your artifacts were just so.
Oh, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun.
You ever shook your last really interesting? It's like one of the last standing.
But I
It's all very much like the most.
Yeah, for
I also probably.
Because my background is music.
Really?
Yeah, that's what I was doing when I was in college.
Oh my gosh.
I was working on, so I went to back when they actually had a music program. They have it in classes now, but it's not like a separate track. And I was doing a lot of work on Scandinavian opera, which is really similar to the frameworks that the English were using. But it does have a cantilever, but it's in the opposite direction of the type that the Pennsylvania Germans would use. And I had actually done quite a bit of work on an 1830s cantilever frame line that was from Levi County back in 2006 and did a restoration on it. And so my background's in fibers,
So I
and patterns especially. I haven't seen it. Well, I'd love to see it.
I was at a friend's today and she was showing me a personal journey with all that.
Yeah, I grew up Protestant, actually my mom converted to Catholicism. It's just like,
It's aluminum tin.
they're very materialistic religions.
Oh, I didn't know they had some.
Beautiful.
Wow. Are they using, are they putting things on?
I grew up in
No, it
Church.
doesn't have any, it doesn't have any leaves or, it just has the frame,
Okay.
but he wants to. So we were talking about.
When you're, if you're on frame, you can have chefs, no problem. The tie-ups are not difficult. I mean, I did it, yeah.
Two travels. So so we were talking about connecting one with my knee to get together.
Yeah.
It's not a lot to set this up because.
How wide is it? Is it about 54? Because a lot of them are 56 with enough for 54. Small. Okay. Wow, okay.
So, so I don't know, I just look.
I gotta ask Ted about that.
But
That's great.
it's pure, it's got some really beautiful.
Feelings you put the.
It's just like, this is cool. Anyway,
Oh, Louis right there. He may have.
and I'm telling the catalog.
If it gets you there, I'll
Oh,
see
cool.
you there.
I'm so glad that I was kind of insulted on his behalf that it was not accepted at Winter Tour, but I have to say it is much better than.
Yes.
That's
The
kind of, that's
entire-
really fun. Yeah.
I was in his house and he was showing material out.
Yes.
But I saw like the materials that he had, like even just in the one, he had a casa in his house, that he opened up and it was just, it was colored, like color arranged and everything. He was so fabulous with that. Oh my gosh. I talked to him just a couple of years ago, did a world history galvanizing course, which is probably a bit of a transition for him, going from his log home with the barn and everything else to assisted living. But definitely, I'm sure he's getting the care.
U-R-G-L-A-A.
He was definitely a special person for the intellect with all the publishers.
About the traditions of Pennsylvania Dutch. But it's.
And he's down at the Birches in Harleysville, so he would probably love to talk about that collection.
Had talked, well, she came up and bring him out here, but that was before he went.
Yeah.
Assisted living, but. go visit him as a group.
He also,
She would do
just
that.
thought, he knows so much about those. And I'm sure he wrote proverbs and things. You might get stories from him.
Oh.
You might be able to do oral histories where you have the collection out and you just record him talking about it. I mean, what, because he's so precise with his memory of things that it just makes, to me, it would be a missed opportunity not to do something like that.
I'll tell you what,
1% of those people.
I mean, with a, this
They
collection
were
is huge.
quite a minority.
So he has it, and it is so verhoodled.
Oh, wow.
You're looking.
But he is not. So they talk like him. You might get some really good information.
Yeah, but.
I'd be willing to drive him up here if you want.
Really?
I'm serious. I'm serious. If you need someone.
I'm good, do you know Jen?
Yeah, I know Jen. Yeah, like seriously, like you all should definitely find a way to connect with him. If I have to be part of it to make it happen, that's fine. Otherwise, like, whatever you need to do. But yeah, I totally agree.
It's been such a good learning experience of it as he goes through that. Just piece by piece.
That's like one of my
Totally
toes,
agree. I totally agree.
dipping my toes into
Well,
even more.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well, nice to meet you. And great to hear about what you're doing with the textile collection.
If you're feeling it inside, you have to.
Reach out to us if you're interested in seeing our units and walking time.
Well, we're gonna head up. And I know you have a time wheel at, like, a church.
We were told it was a kind of, but I don't know for sure. It sure looks like it could be, but I don't know that it's not dated.
It's not signed.
Not that I know of. No. How did you know? Did Ted tell you? Or Tom Stokes? Because Tom was the one who told me he thought it looked like, what's that?
Lauren told me.
Oh, okay.
But we have one here,
I should actually double check.
and that is signed David.
This one has I mean, this one is beautifully made, but no signature on it. And we put it in the exhibition with Mountain Mary's material and Oley Valley stuff. And Tom was like, this looks like a kind piece. And I said, I don't know what it is, but I know I put it in here because I wanted there to be a textile piece in the exhibition because of her connection with Spain. That was why I put it in there. And to my knowledge, I don't know what Ehrenberg's came from.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Tom was the one who said,
Yeah.
Camp Hill,
looks like it could be from,
now I live in Hershey.
from Con, so.
Yeah. I work at the library there, it's really
Yeah,
cool.
well, I'd be happy to show it to you.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Is your contact information?
There's an email address, it's just heritage@kutztown.edu, and if you send us an email, it'll get to me. And there's also a phone number in there too. I unfortunately don't have a card on me, otherwise I give you one
No,
of those too.
that's okay.
Do I? I do.
Oh, wow, okay.
Just don't send us a fax, because that fax line is no longer active. In case you like to fax emails.
And I'm Tina.
Okay, nice to meet you, Tina.
It's nice to meet you too, Patrick.
Absolutely.
I'm Marie. I'm learning a lot about textiles from Tina.
Great.
And my brother bought a property on Mount Mary Road. And so I was just like, I have to
yeah.
hear all about this. Now I'll have to find out.
Yeah,
who
you'll have to meet the
church is.
neighbors. Yeah. Well, and the people who own the property are lovely. They're
Yeah.
wonderful people. I know that they're, I've asked about taking groups over there, and they've been a little more reluctant in recent years, but they're great people. You know. There's a bunch of things about it. It's not quite as hospitable as it used to be, but they are still hospitable. They're great people, even though the property is hard to navigate.
Yeah.
Well, nice to meet you.
Yeah, yeah.
Come up to Wisconsin.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah, fantastic.
I didn't mean to put you.
No, you guys are first.
Just wanted to say it was a pleasure to help you out.
Thank you. You just like jumped in to help. I appreciate it. Because they told me someone was going to be in the back fixing the slides, and I was like, there's nobody there.
My name is Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate you jumping in and
The
helping.
cultural center has been on my list.
Yeah.
Because in recent, the past couple of years that they had on the festival, I attended.
Yeah.
Loved every.
I really loved it too, and it's sad it's not
so
there
sad,
anymore.
and I think that maybe relates to your comment about years of like, is this what we need to develop, and how do we continue to build those connections?
Take care.
So,
Well, I always have strong feelings about it because
yeah.
there's this tendency that folks will say, well, if you can't make money on the culture, it means there's no interest. And I think there's actually, that is, if anything, correlation, not causation. Interest does not necessarily always translate directly into people spending money on the subject. And I actually think that the commercialized model didn't work so well for the Film Festival. I think the educational stuff was great. I think that what was going on in terms of the craftspeople who were very directly relevant, the bearers of tradition in the community, I think that was very effective. I think the idea of turning it more into a sales-based operation was part of what created the perception of its decline. But that's my impression of all this, because I don't think interest is waned. I think it's people don't have the financial resources to spend.
You and I, we represent a newer generation of extreme interest.
Yeah, for sure.
I was just saying that I really didn't know anything about powwowing until within the last year, so it's been exciting. Do you take Venmo for anything, or do you cash only?
We do cash only, but if you want to send us something, you can do it. If you want to send us a check or something like that, that would be fine.
It's like honor system?
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
I do
Trust me. I mean, even with this.
Sure.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
You need that book.
No, you told me.
You have to invest.
That is 45.
Right, yeah.
But I can give you the member price at 40. So
Thank you
that's
very
no
much.
problem. Here's what I'll suggest. If you can send me an email, and I will send you an invoice, and then you can just.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate
No
that so
problem.
much.
Fantastic. No problem at all. Just come visit us sometime. That'd be fun.
I would love to.
Get into it.
Trust me, my dad and I have sort of been vibing with each other over the past few years with genealogy, and his surname is Erner. So we're descendants of some of the founders of the Coventry Church of the Brethren.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
So-
Wow.
I've never really identified myself as Pennsylvania Dutch, because I'm just thinking of like Amish, Lancaster County, that's not me. But now I'm just like, this whole world is opening up to me of like, oh, he's Swiss, but spoke German, is definitely from that area, and definitely represents this Anabaptist movement to America, so I.
Definitely.
Yep.
Now, in Coventry, is that Chester County?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure I was thinking of the right place.
Or is it, I get confused. Yeah, I think it's Chester.
Yeah.
It's not, Montgomery is just north.
Yeah. So it's right along that border region.
Okay, yeah, so it must be.
Route 23.
Yes.
basically.
Yeah, and I'm in New Holland, so.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
A line.
Cool, fantastic. Awesome.
Oh, thank you so
Well, yeah,
much.
absolutely. Thanks for
It was
coming out
wonderful.
this evening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great to meet you.
Nice meeting you,
Take
Sarah.
care.
You know, it might be more, Lincoln.
Hi. You look really familiar.
Ken Smith.
Ken Smith. Oh, excellent. Fantastic. Nice to see you
I
again.
became the resident since.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Awesome.
Yeah.
How are you enjoying it?
Oh, okay. Maybe once, Pat and,
Ray.
retire.
Well, if I had known, I would have even thought, I should have thought of you at Easter, because they double booked accidentally, and they went to another event for Easter.
Well,
if
no, I'm in town now.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a card of yours, but I can give you mine. If you want to reach out, we can connect.
No, but Doc Bruner, I think.
Yeah.
That probably didn't work for him. I mean, he was in Roosevelt.
I believe it.
Because when he died, at age of 72, I was like 18. I was
I
just.
got a business card of his recently.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's
But, no, you know what I'm saying? So when you mentioned him,
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, no worries. You can shoot me an email or something and we'll stay in touch.
Well, I gotta get up to visit, who works in the office with you, the young lady?
Sarah.
Sarah. She was at Brookside Lodge with David at.
Yes.
I've been taking classes with David and Jimmy.
Yeah.
I mean, I should know more than I know. I wish I could speak
that's
a
okay.
lot fluent enough.
Yeah.
Because Dad spoke it, but he just didn't. Every time I hear Doug Maidensworth, I get upset. He's only 40, 44.
I know.
Can speak it so fluently. He did Pennsylvania German service at
Yes.
Becker's, so I
Yes.
went to that the other
Yes.
Saturday.
he does a really nice
But
job.
I'm gonna miss, I have my Tinsmith convention in Williamsburg.
On the day of the Pennsylvania
Well,
German Day.
well, it's Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Yeah.
So,
Well, sorry you're gonna miss it.
no,
Yeah, we'll stop
great
in.
talking.
You as well.
We met once or twice.
Yeah, absolutely. I know your face for sure. I know we've spoken a bunch, so.
Well, they say I look right like my dad.
Yeah.
They always said we were brothers. You know, my dad, being a Dutchman, he was cheap. You know, he was in the roofing business, of course, first.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was Earl Smith. And he didn't want Ann's son, because he goes, okay, son, who is it? I want people to know who you are. So he didn't want to repaint the trucks Earl and Ken Smith. So it was Ken Ann, real small.
That's funny.
He just did Ken Ann, you know, it was like this big, and then Earl Smith stayed the same. He just added Ken Ann. But he didn't want to do Ann's son.
That's amazing. I love that.
Because he always wanted, he goes, I want people to know your name, you know.
Absolutely. Well, that's kind of him.
No, it was, but then, of course, with the Ken Ann or whatever, they always thought we were
Brothers. Oh, that's funny. Wow.
And then I'm standing at my mother's funeral, and people that my dad and I know, my wife's standing, I have 4 daughters. And so it's me, my wife, my youngest daughter's the tallest, and then the oldest is the short, so it was like, and then this guy comes up and goes, oh, which daughter is this? It's like,
Oh.
to my wife, you know, saying, you know, it's like, thanks. So, I can't win. My wife's my daughter, and I'm my dad's brother. Hey, take care.
Good talking to you.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much. Thanks for coming out.
Hey, I won't
All right,
keep you too long.
nice to see you.
It's great to see you.
Maxwell, is that right? Okay. Fantastic.
I finally got a copy of one of these.
Oh my gosh.
I'd like you to
I
sign
hope
it.
you didn't have to pay too much
No,
for it.
I got it in PA German version from some older woman in North Carolina.
Wow.
I forget her name, but
She said she had a copy and got rid of it. Well, that's great, because I'll tell you what, I have seen copies of this go for $400 on eBay.
I got it for like $10.
Great. Oh, that's good. Awesome. You want me to sign it?
Yeah, wherever you feels appropriate.
I didn't leave any, so I started doing this thing with any books that I do, primarily because I've signed so darn many books that it is so nice to have a half title page that you can sign.
Not
This one, it's like, there's nowhere to sign, so.
Are there any plans to reissue it?
You know, so there's a couple things that have happened. Do you mind if I sign right out here?
Yeah, wherever you guys.
Should I say to Maxwell?
Whatever you want to do. You're the broker.
And Maxwell?
Correct.
Okay.
2 L's.
Fantastic. So there are plans at some point in time to re-release it, except there's a point in time in here somewhere where I mention, where is it? Somewhere in here I give Wilbur Oda a hard time. Where I talk about how Wilbur Oda claimed that he had where is it? He claimed that he had an English edition, and I kind of decided not to badmouth Oda and just skipped over it. So Wilbur Oda claimed he had an English edition. So he claimed that he had an English edition. He even like kind of stated it kind of off the cuff about how he had one sitting next to him while writing this thing about John George Woolman, and I was just like, you're a bibliographer, and like for all of the others that are caring about bibliography, it's like you'd think he would have said what the title was, where it was printed, when, and he doesn't say a word about it, and I'm just like, I just wondered like, was there some misunderstanding? Right. And that's why I didn't cite it. And I thought for some reason I had cited it. I think I originally put it in and then I took it out, and that's why I was still looking for it, because in my mind it's still in the original edition, or original manuscript version. But I am calling it turned up an English edition. And
what?
Yep.
Whoa.
And since that time, I've learned that there is not one but two.
Different
and
translations?
Possibly a third. And so now I'm like, well, and one of them was like, literally calls it Negromancy. Which is pretty interesting. Because I mean, you're making magic with the black arts as opposed to with corpses. So I mean, I guess that's maybe maybe it was clarifying.
Yeah.
So that was one. That was pretty wild. And then there's this other one that's attributed to this fellow from like Boonesboro, Maryland, named Michael Zittle. And he was known as the Wizard Zittle. And he produced this like off-the-cuff translation of it, because he likely had an original German. And his translation is totally wacky. But if you look carefully at it, you can see all these ways that his translation was like an approximation of like maybe some misunderstanding of the German based upon his ear. Because he spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, like there's no question about that. But like that doesn't mean everybody who speaks Pennsylvania Dutch can read standard German.
Yeah.
So there was like some stuff in there where I'm like, huh, that's really weird. And some of it he would like add extra stuff and kind of his own little flair to it. And it's like, it's a garbled mess. I'm just gonna say, like it's a problematic source, but it's fascinating stuff. And then there was this woman, I can't remember her name, but she was has to do with magic on South Mountain. And I might have a reference to it somewhere in here about like other editions of The Friend in Need. And she like is this kind of like scolding lady talking about like, she was like really like negative about the tradition, like really intensely negative. And it was fascinating that she wrote all this, and she actually produced some translations and entries of it. So I didn't know about that. Of course, Donmoyer knew about it and never mentioned it when I was